With your permission, can I address an elephant in the room? Because I've always, because sometimes we do hear that you were talking about false allegations and determining parental alienation. So I'll just read you a little quote from a woman named Kim Hawkins, and she's the executive director of the Rise Women's Legal Center in Vancouver, because sometimes false allegations of abuse, when made by women, are somehow turned against them. And Kim says that what we're seeing in practice is that parental alienation claims are being brought by parents who've been accused of family violence. And I know that that's also an issue in the United States, that women are actually being told to silence domestic abuse for fear of having their children taken away, or that it could somehow be used in a parental alienation silver bullet for custody. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm not a lawyer, but it does make me curious. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Barbara, that's an important question, and it's an interesting one as well. From an anecdotal standpoint, not a research standpoint, but purely anecdotal standpoint, I have represented women and men who have been targeted with alienation, targeted parents who have been on the receiving end of alienating behaviors.
Okay.
So parents who are complaining that we have been alienated from our children by the other parent, both men and women. I have also represented both men and women who have complained that the other parent has falsely accused them of parental alienation. I mean, most recently, I represented a woman in Michigan court who was falsely accused of alienation, when all she was trying to do is to protect the child and protect herself from abusive behaviors and from nonstop controlling behavior. And we took it to the trial. We showed the judge what was going on. We showed that how she is not alienating. She's trying to protect the kid, and she's trying to defend herself as well. And at the end of the day, the court saw that. But I did not stand up and start spewing nonsense and argue that the alienation theory is junk science, or parental alienation doesn't exist, or that this whole thing was dreamt by Richard Gardner. I mean, that's nonsense. You can argue a case based on the facts of the case without just throwing the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. At the end of the day, both women and men are victims of parental alienation. And like any other theory, like any other syndrome or concept, yes, the concept of parental alienation is often and sometimes misused or miscategorized as alienation. One of the commonly held misunderstanding in this field is that people who are against the theory of alienation, they argue that the proponents of parental alienation argue that every child who rejects a parent must be alienated. That's a straw man argument. No one says that. No bona fide expert, no proponent of parental alienation who has done research, who has published in this field, who knows what they are talking about, has ever said that you can find parental alienation simply because a child has rejected the parent. But it's easier to say that and to create that aura, because then you can demolish it easily, And that's the essence of a straw man argument. And in court, when you argue alienation, you have to be sure, you have to be certain. Otherwise, you lose credibility. I don't walk into a court and start arguing alienation as the first sign of violation of parenting time, for example. We don't walk into the court and argue alienation the moment a child is defiant or disrespectful or rude to a parent. Before you make a claim of parental alienation, there needs to be significant evidence, usually based on the 5-factor model, which we can talk later on. Mm-hmm. But you don't just make that allegation. So is the theory sometimes misused? Yes. I mean, if you look at the other side of the coin, how many cases do we have where one party falsely accuses the other of domestic violence. How many cases do we have where the Child Protective Services or law enforcement are repeatedly called in to investigate an allegation of abuse and then didn't find abuse? I mean, how many cases where we have where one parent calls CPS again and again and again and again and forces the child to go through significant amount of intrusive medical examinations when the doctors have ruled out abuse, but the parent refuses to give up? At some point in time, the court needs to stop that abuse and stop that situation. Courts have found that it's abusive for the child to undergo this repeated interactions, repeated investigations, repeated interviews by police, by CPS, by nurses, by doctors. That child is being robbed of its normal childhood, his or her normal childhood. Now, that doesn't mean that we ignore abuse allegations. I mean, protective services are bound to investigate every allegation. But at some point in time, we need to decide whether these allegations of abuse have merit. And if not, why are they being made? No doubt there's an element of some coercive control in many situations. No doubt many people chose to stay silent about the abuse that happened during the marriage. And they're only speaking out now because they are bold enough to come out and file for divorce. Right. So not every case of alienation, not every allegation of parental alienation is true. In a similar nature, not every allegation of domestic violence is true. And that's why we have courts. And one of the hallmark of our Anglo-American system of jurisprudence is adversarial method. An allegation has to be tested and proved in a court of law. And even though some temporary measures are put in place, sometimes to protect the children at early on, sometimes even on ex parte basis, the courts at the end of the day have to give the person who is accused of abuse his or her day in the court. And that's where you try to prove a case of abuse or allegation.
Right. I think you've made some really good points and clarified a lot of points. Thank you for that.